to The Metro on WDET. I'm Robin Vincent.
And I'm Tia Graham. On Tuesday, President Trump's order to place 10% tariffs on Chinese imports went into effect, and China was apparently ready, placing retaliatory tariffs on 15% of U.S. goods. Meanwhile, the proposed tariffs on goods from Canada and Mexico are temporarily paused after both countries agreed to send troops to their respective borders with the U.S., and a deal that President Trump says will help stop migrants from entering the U.S. and slow the illegal flow of fentanyl.
Senior producer David Lyons spoke with Bharat Ramamurthy, senior advisor for economic strategy at the American Economic Liberties Project and former economic communications advisor for the Biden-Harris administration. He explains what tariffs are and reflects on the tariffs that did and didn't take effect this week.
We're going to get into the most recent U.S.-China tariffs that went into effect this week later, but first, can you give me a chalkboard definition of what tariffs are?
Yes, a tariff is a tax on imports. And so the best way to think about it is if you are a company and you are importing a good from Canada or from Mexico or from China, and it costs a certain amount of money, a 10% tariff on that item would mean that you will pay 10% of the cost of importing that item as a tax to the federal government. That's
a cost that has to get passed on to a consumer through the company that's selling it to them. Is that right?
Right. So the first step is the company pays a certain amount of a tax on the import that it brings in. Mm-hmm. And then the question is, what does the company do with that additional cost, right? If you think about it, there's a few different alternatives, right? Alternative one is that the company says that additional tax on a good from a foreign country makes that item so much more expensive that we're not going to buy it anymore. Instead, what we're going to do is look for alternatives from other countries or from the United States, right? And that, in many ways, is the intended effect of a tariff, right? The point of a tariff, in many ways, is to discourage the import of that good and force the company in the United States to look for alternatives that may be produced domestically. Now, the issue is that companies can't just do that at the drop of a hat, right? If you're a manufacturing company that relies on certain products from China to manufacture the good that you produce, it's not very easy to just say a week later, I can find an alternative for that's produced in the United States or produced in some other country. So in that instance, you may just end up swallowing that additional 10% cost. And then, more likely than not, that additional cost will be passed along to the consumer at the end of the day, because a lot of businesses can't afford to just absorb that additional cost. The alternative, of course, is that you look for options that are not from that foreign country. Now, again, there may not be pre-existing options in the United States to fill that need. Or if you think about it from an economic perspective, if you are an American company that makes that product and now your competitor has additional 10% tax on the product that it's bringing in, your logical move is going to be to raise your own prices because you can't, knowing that your competitors' prices have gone up. So that means that basically in either event, either if the company brings in the good from China or some foreign country or finds a local alternative, the prices are going to go up. That's just basic economics.
Mm-hmm. With the active tariff right now, a 10% tariff that the U.S. has placed on Chinese goods and the retaliatory 15% tariff on U.S. goods imported to China, what are the industries that are going to be most affected? Where are we going to see that there isn't an alternative for U.S. consumers to shift where we're purchasing our goods from?
A lot of the goods that come in from China go into manufacturing processes in the United States. So there's electronics products, there's computer products that come from China. Some of them are end products. It's a item that you actually go and buy on the shelf. But more often than not, it's something that goes into a bigger manufacturing process in the United States, and then it results in an appliance or a television or something that you're used to going to the store and buying. The truth of the matter is that given the scope of Chinese manufacturing in particular, it's often hard for companies to find alternatives to the Chinese option And oftentimes those alternatives, if they exist, are going to be much more expensive than the Chinese option. So the short-term impact of these tariffs on China are going to be, there's no way around it, an increase in costs that American consumers face on a wide variety of goods.
And is there a long-term benefit where the tariffs will help the United States get our other industries going? I'm thinking about the CHIPS Act that was enacted by President Biden and trying to build up this chips industry in the U.S. so we can really produce them domestically and not depend on China for so many things that, like you said, they just manufacture so much stuff that we use in our economy. Is there a long-term benefit there, and how do we get to that point? How long does that kind of thing take to shape up?
Yeah, absolutely. Tariffs can be used for strategic purposes, but I think it's important to distinguish between a targeted tariff on a particular industry or set of goods and the across-the-board tariff that the Trump administration is implementing. You know, in the Biden administration, we put tariffs on certain steel and aluminum products that were coming from abroad, and for certain microchips and other things where we felt like it was extremely important for both economic and national security reasons that we have a thriving American industry in that area. And by contrast, with this across-the-board tariff, it's harder to see any strategic purpose. You know, it may be the case that we want to become less dependent on Chinese manufacturing. I think that's a good thing. But the idea of completely detaching ourselves from China also carries risks with it. And we should think carefully about whether there is some sort of higher economic or national security purpose to avoiding bringing in cheap textiles or cheap minor economic electronic products from China, rather than trying to develop a local industry. The other thing is that oftentimes you have to pair that tariff with federal government support for bringing that industry back to the United States. You know, we saw that, like you said, with the CHIPS Act. There were tariffs and restrictions on imports from foreign countries, but at the same time, a big federal investment in making sure that we could develop a thriving local industry for building those types of, very important products. The Trump administration isn't pairing these tariffs with any sort of domestic investment. So what will happen is that no domestic industry arises to take the place of the imports that we're making more expensive from China. And the net effect of that, both the short term and the long term, is simply higher prices for American companies and American consumers.
Mm-hmm. Higher prices for Americans, and that's in the short term, and maybe in the medium term as well, depending on how those industries react. You're listening to the Metro on Detroit Public Radio. I'm David Lyons, and I'm speaking with Bharat Ramamurthy, Senior Advisor for Economic Strategy at the American Economic Liberties Project, about the tariffs that did and didn't take effect this week. You mentioned using tariffs strategically and often paired with government policy and support to build up industries, but what about using tariffs as negotiating tactics and as levers of power to achieve other means? So, for example, this week it was announced that President Trump would enact 25% tariffs on Canadian and Mexican goods in the 11th hour. That was put on pause for a month, and part of that deal apparently was for both countries to send some troops to their respective borders to beef up border security, supposedly in an effort to reduce illegal immigration and the illegal flow of fentanyl into the United States. How have tariffs been used in the past as a negotiating tactic for something that wasn't necessarily an economic or industrial objective?
Well, first, I think it's important to put some context around what Mexico and Canada agreed to do in the face of the announced tariffs. Canada basically reaffirmed a plan that it had already announced last year under the Biden administration to dedicate more resources to the border and to addressing fentanyl that's crossing the northern border. There was no new agreement there. Mm-hmm. And the same thing with Mexico. They agreed to dedicate 10,000 troops to the border. There's already 15,000 troops at the border, in part because of agreements that they made with the Biden administration last year. So I think these were largely face-saving concessions that the Trump administration extracted. I really think that there's not a lot of new substance there. That aside, of course, look, America is a very attractive consumer market, and companies from all across the world want to get into the American market and access American consumers. And that is leverage that we can exert in the world. And one of the reasons that Congress has authorized the president to use tariffs is to protect national security. So tariffs are a really flexible, potentially powerful tool, but they carry with them very clear costs. Right? They almost certainly will lead to increases in prices for Americans. That's how they work, right? The whole point is by imposing and making imported goods more expensive, that will either help domestic industry or discourage Americans from buying that product altogether. That's the theory of tariffs. And so can they be used strategically to help with certain national security and economic goals? Yes, we did that in the Biden administration. Does it really make sense to be imposing across-the-board tariffs on some of our closest trading partners like Canada and Mexico, where we're generally allies with them on a wide variety of issues? I don't really see the case for that. And I think that's in part why the Trump announcement didn't really lead to any serious concessions from either Canada or Mexico.
Mm-hmm. And I guess it raises the question for me about the relationship between Canada, Mexico, and the United States economically and with our manufacturing. Here in Detroit and Southeast Michigan, so much of our local economy is parts and manufacturing that goes across the border multiple times. How does that affect on a long-term scale businesses that are run either in the United States or in Canada that rely on these manufacturing relationships with companies that are across the border? Is there a destabilizing effect is what I'm asking for these particular companies?
Yeah, absolutely. I think destabilizing is a good word. Uncertainty is another word that you hear about a lot. And I just want to take an example. Imagine that you are a home builder here in the United States. We've got a real housing shortage in the United States. It's important that home builders put money behind building lots of new housing across the United States. Well, if you rely on lumber that comes from Canada and other products for the house that come from Mexico, and you're not sure whether your costs are going to be 10, 15, 20% higher because of potential tariffs, are you really going to decide to put a lot of money into new construction until you have more certainty about all of that? Right. So what ends up happening is companies stay on the sidelines. Businesses decide not to make big capital investments because there's so much uncertainty about what their costs are going to be. Even if these tariffs are announced and then ultimately taken down very quickly or not even put in place because of an agreement that's reached between the countries, it's very hard for businesses in that environment to make long-term decisions. And that's going to have real harms for folks in both the short term and the long term.
Mm-hmm. And I guess my final question for you is these tariffs with Canada and Mexico were put on pause for a 30-day period of time with from President Trump's side, potential of them still going into effect depending on other economic deals that may be drawn. You mentioned that this was very much to save face the claim that there was a deal struck in the first place to avert the tariffs. How likely are we to see tariffs on Canada and Mexico come into action in the next month, given how they fizzled out this time?
It's hard to say. Again, the rationale for these tariffs seem to change hour by hour. Right. First, it's about the trading imbalance between particular countries and how tariffs can help reduce that imbalance. Then it's about drugs crossing the border. Then it's about immigration. If you have all of these different rationales, then it's hard to predict when new tariffs will be announced and what will prompt the reduction in those tariffs, what the other countries have to do, supposedly, in order to cause those tariffs to be eliminated. So, frankly, it's hard for me to predict what will happen with these tariffs and what might prompt the Trump administration to announce that they're going to try to to reimpose them. And that gets back to my earlier point about uncertainty for businesses. They might be feeling good today that the tariffs that were announced were not actually going to go into effect. But a month later, they could turn around and the tariffs will be in effect, and that will completely change their cost of doing business and affect the value of the investments that they would have made. And that's why I really do think, and I've talked to folks in the business community who have reinforced this, a lot of folks are going to stay on the sidelines and keep their powder dry because of the uncertainty caused by all of this potential chaos. And for a president who campaigned on trying to bring costs down for Americans, both the tariffs and the uncertainty caused by the potential of tariffs are both driving costs up.
Mm. And there could be a chilling effect, I guess, on economic growth in general if the investments don't seem to be sound ones, because you can't balance your ledger and know what it's really going to cost.
Exactly.
All right. Well, Bharat Ramamurthy, thank you so much for joining us on the Metro. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks very much.
That was the Metro's senior producer, David Lyons, speaking with Bharat Ramamurthy. He's a senior advisor for economic strategy at the American Economic Liberties Project and a former advisor for the Biden-Harris administration.
Coming up at 11, our information landscape in the current political age are both marked by chaos, and that means people have had to shift the way they engage with a variety of media outlets. So, in the next hour, we want to know, how has your media diet changed over time? Give us a call. The number is 313-577-1019.
This is WDET-FM, Detroit Public Radio, your connection to news, music, and conversation. And this is The Metro. We'll be right back.